Alright guys, so today I thought I'd do something a little different. I thought I would do a repair video. Gentleman on YouTube sent me this Game Gear, which is still wrapped here. He's having some issues with the screen being dim and a couple other problems, which I suspect are going to be faulty capacitors. So let's get this open and actually test out the game console and see what we're dealing with. Alright, now actually I just finished recapping my personal Game Gear, which of course recapping is just a slang term for replacing the capacitors. I guess that's what they use on the streets. That's the AKA for replacing capacitors. So we're starting to see more and more of these Game Gears experience this capacitor plague issue, which is not uncommon for a capacitor to stop working after 20 something odd years. So alright, let's take a look. This thing's in pretty good shape. Doesn't look like it's got an original screen lens on it, which has a crack in it already, so that's probably going to need to be replaced. Still got the strap on it too. Let's see if we got batteries in here. No batteries, but no worries. Got a AC adapter ready to go right here. Let's get one of our favorites. Not really. Sonic Labyrinth. Now, sometimes the screen will be really dim on these when the capacitors are having problems. More so than usual. I know the screen's not great on these, but definitely more so than normal. But also, you may experience issues with the sound being really, really low. So let's see what we got here. This is the first time I've turned this on, obviously. Alright. So far, nothing. Could just be a dirty cartridge. But this could also be related to the capacitor issue. See if I can see the game at a weird angle here. There we go. Believe it or not, the screen doesn't look that bad. It's a little off color, and the contrast is a little off. You kind of have to hold it at a weird angle to be able to get a good view of the screen. But as you can hear, or can't hear, there is no sound. So no matter how I adjust, there is no sound. So we'll definitely need to replace the capacitors on the soundboard as well. But first thing I'll do, get this thing opened up, replace all the capacitors on the motherboard, and then we'll turn it on and see what we have. So let's get the screwdriver ready and get this thing cracked open. All right. So before we begin, a couple of things. First, there are two different mainboard revisions for the original Game Gear. There's one that's referred to as the 2 ASIC version, and then there's one that's referred to as the single ASIC version. Now, the big difference between the two, obviously, is going to be the 2 ASIC version is going to have two separate custom chips versus the single ASIC version, which is going to have one custom chip, for the most part. So, the reason you're going to need to know this before you order your capacitors is you need to know what type of capacitors to get, because there are differences between the two mainboard revisions, and you'll need different types of capacitors. And when I say different types, for the most part, the parts list that you're going to need to order is pretty much the same. But there will be, let's say, for the 2 ASIC version, you might need a couple of 16 microfarad 10 volt capacitors that you wouldn't need for the other version. So just something to keep in mind. Open up your Game Gear first and see what you have. And there are parts lists readily available online. I'll try to link some down in the description below as well. As far as ordering capacitors, you can go with the ready-made, easy, put-together cap kits that people will sell online. The only problem I have with those is that sometimes the capacitors tend to be really cheap. Chinese-made capacitors that may last for a while, but you're not really going to be sure. What I'll typically do is go in and inventory the caps myself. And like what we have here is a, if it'll focus on it, is a Nichicon capacitor. And this will go into this Game Gear here. These and Panasonic and a couple other brands are probably some of the best capacitors that you can buy. I will actually spend the extra money and get the what I consider to be automotive grade, long-lasting, 105 degrees Celsius temperature threshold capacitors, which is certainly overkill, but for a couple of cents more, why not put the best you can buy outside of solid-state capacitors into these game systems? Because to be honest, it's not fun to go in here and do this every couple of years. If you're going to do it, you might as well do it right the first time. So opening up the Game Gear, for the most part, it's pretty easy. However, there is one curveball. You're going to need one of these single inline security bits, which is similar to what the Nintendo systems use, like the Super Nintendo and the N64 and the GameCube. All use this type of bit, and there's only one screw that uses it, so you may be able to find alternate methods to get this thing open. I know a classic trick is to heat up a Bic pen and then where it's molten and slap it on there and break it loose that way, but if you're going to work on game systems, why not just go ahead and invest a couple of bucks and get you one of these bits. So actually, we'll pop this one off first. Get that out of the way. Alright, organize the screws. Go ahead and pull the battery covers off. There's two screws underneath the battery cover. And these things are really simple to take apart. Now, I'm not 100% sure which version of Game Gear this is, but I do have capacitors for both. So, no matter what, we should be in good shape. My advice, too, would be, even if your Game Gear is not showing any obvious issues, seems to be working okay, I would go ahead and plan on doing this. Reason being is a lot of times the capacitors will start to leak electrolytic fluid, and then you may run into issues with corrosion, problems with the traces on the motherboard, and if you're having to do trace repair, that's when it can start to get a little messy. So might want to consider this just as a preventative maintenance to keep your game system working for as long as possible. There we go. There's going to be a couple of ribbon cables here. We actually have the 2 ASIC version. And I'll show you what I mean once I pop these ribbon cables loose. Alright. And pull the strap out of the way, and there we have it. There's the Game Gear motherboard. So let's get in here and take a look at these capacitors and see if they've already started leaking. Alright, so we'll kind of just take a tour of the motherboard here. Now, this is the 2 ASIC version, as I mentioned before. So as you can see, clearly these are two separate custom Sega chips. In the single ASIC version, you'll actually have just one big chip here, which incorporates a majority of the components. Actually here, this one has a discrete CPU, which I'll show you in just a minute. But also, let's look at the capacitors. And it looks like I don't see much corrosion here, so that's good. So maybe these things have failed, but not actually completely spewed their contents all over the main board yet. This actually is surprisingly clean. So look over on this side. Here's your memory right here. I'm not exactly sure what the size is. And then here is your Z80 CPU. This is rated for 6 megahertz, but it's only running at 3.5, similar to the Master System. In the single ASIC version, this would be incorporated into the large custom chip, so you wouldn't see this discrete Z80 processor sitting here. Checking out some of the other capacitors. Yeah, this board is surprisingly clean. So maybe some of the caps have died and they just haven't started leaking yet. So that's good news. We'll go ahead and start pulling these caps off and start replacing them. Now, before we just start popping capacitors off the main board, there's a couple of things we want to pay attention to. One is the polarity of the capacitor, which you can clearly see it marked here, plus and minus. Also, if you happen to remove these and not pay attention to the way these are positioned, then you can also see the silkscreen print on the main board. Sega was courteous enough to print plus and minus on the main board, so you'd be able to properly replace these. I'm assuming that's not the real purpose, but it's handy nonetheless. Also, another thing we'll want to look at is these gold circles here. Basically, this is where the top part of the case will come down and meet with the motherboard. So we don't want to lay any capacitors in this area. Now, to remove the capacitor, what I'll do is just either take a pair of pliers or just grab one of these capacitors here on the opposite end of where the legs are. There's a small amount of glue that's underneath the capacitor. So you'll kind of hear that cracking as we pop it loose, and then we'll just raise it up, and that's when you know it's free from the board. Now you can either desolder this, or you can just rock it back and forth and literally just break the capacitor off very carefully off of the motherboard. And oh yeah, there's definitely a little bit of corrosion down there, but that's fine, we'll clean it up. You can see the pads here. Now all you have to do is just kind of put a little solder on there and clean up the pads and attach your replacement capacitor. So I'll do this first one here, and then we'll do a jump cut. I'll replace all these capacitors, and then we'll give it a shot. Well, I went to pull this cap on the soundboard, and as you can see, that is some nasty corrosion right there. As soon as I removed this capacitor, I'm surprised it didn't pull any traces up, but that capacitor has been leaking and has severely damaged some of the traces here. So I'll have to clean this up, and I bet as soon as I replace this cap and get everything patched up, then the sound will magically start working again. So we will see. Alright, got all the capacitors replaced. Put this thing back together. I haven't tested it yet, so let's do that now. Gonna put in the same game we had before. Hopefully we have nice bright picture and sound. There we are. All right. Looks like we're good. So this thing's working again. All right. So another Game Gear fix just because of faulty capacitors. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm going to go play some Sonic Labyrinth.